I think that hiring excellence to me is the ability to like just take one company, one role, one manager, the same one, but pitch it and sell it entirely differently to two different candidates, right? And I'm not selling. I don't mean selling the wrong package, like telling lies. I mean just once again adapting your pitch, adapting the way you're gonna your candidate management and the experience you're gonna provide the candidate with like hyper personalization.
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. Your host, Shannon Ogborn, interviews top talent acquisition leaders, uncovering their secrets to building and leading successful recruiting teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I'm Shannon Ogborn, your host, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform empowering ambitious teams from seed to IPO and beyond. I am here with Virgile Raingeard, CEO at Figures, an all-in-one compensation management platform. Before founding Figures, Virgile was working in many different capacities across HR and recruiting, including being a VP of People. He is a wealth of knowledge in this space, so I'm super excited to have him on Offer Accepted today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Shannon, for the invite. Pleasure to be here.
To give the audience a little bit of background on yourself, can you tell us some about Figures and your role there?
Yeah, of course. To understand Figures, first, I think I need to tell a little bit more about myself. As you said, I've been like in HR my whole life. In fact, I started in talent acquisition, then moved to generalist HR, moved to Comp and Ben, so compensation and benefits, sorry. I did a bit of tech talent acquisition. I was head of tech talent acquisition at Criteo for a year or so, like 15%. Then moved back to generalist HR, was a VP of people operation, and I decided to create Figures a bit more than 3 years ago now to create the compensation management platform I would have loved to use back when I was an HR professional. And I'm the CEO, like easy. CEO role is fairly easy, I think, to explain.
Sometimes.
Easier than most, I guess. Yeah, sometimes. I'm nothing too specific. I just try to ensure the company survives and thrives, I guess. That's pretty much a big thing.
That's a big responsibility. So I would give yourself a little bit more credit on that. But as you had mentioned, you have experience in both HR and recruiting space. In regards to sort of the intersection of that, what do you feel like is one of the biggest challenges that has been the case for TA in your mind between that experience of people operations and TA and your experience launching Figures?
So I think the biggest macro thing is for TA being seen as an adjustment variable. When things go well, they're being put under so much pressure to hire, hire, hire. And I was there, right? So back when I was the head of TA, as I said, like hire, hire like crazy. You're not delivering enough. You need to hire more, more, more. Then suddenly fire, terminate, and then you need to terminate half of the team and so on. The recent things we've seen in some of the tech space the past few months and years have been just so much of a nightmare for TA. So I think that's the hardest thing. When you look at the macro level, this is the hardest thing, having to sustain the pressure of like craziness of high times and downturn afterwards. That's the hardest thing at the macro level. When zooming in on the role though, I think the hardest thing is there's so many stakeholders, so many things to master if you want to do the job well, right? In a way, the first company's salesperson, you get to pitch the company, the culture, the business, the various teams, the various roles, various departments, the managers, manager styles, the team spirits, the team habits, the tech stack, the compensation structure, and we get back to that. It's super hard role to master. I think in a way, like you get to be the salesperson for that. And then you get to be pretty good at managing your internal stakeholders, managing the external person you're talking to. So there's so many things that you have to do well to succeed at this role. I mean, it's a bit mind boggling. And of course, one of those and one of the hardest one, I think, was like mastering compensation, right? And how it plays an important part into your role and to candidate expectation. And that's going to become even more of the case moving forward as well.
Definitely. And have you seen there to be a big gap in compensation knowledge with talent to where you think they should be in terms of being able to pitch, talk about equity and all of those things?
100%. So I think all in all, I think I've seen very few TA recruiting people who like master the ability to just talk about compensation in general, like the complexity and the mechanics of like compensation, how does like base salary works, how does equity work, like how many TA people, and you know what, how many HR like people overall just fully knows how does the stock option work, how does the vesting schedule look like, and so on. Very few. So I think it's a very tricky topic for HR and recruiters all over, and which I think is not shouldn't be considered as normal, given how much of candidates' expectations they represent. Right.
Definitely. Can you tell me a little bit about, and this is obviously a big part of your business model too, why is it so important to put a focus on compensation, on understanding compensation from a recruiting perspective?
Hmm. Great question. So I think it was always the case that compensation was important to people, right? It's not like you keep hearing some people like just don't care about compensation and so on. Like it's not true. And I think even in the past few years, you might have been under the impression that like with the pandemic and so on, like it was all about finding meaning in your role, work-life balance and so on being important. I'm not saying they're not, right? I'm not saying they're not for sure, but when you look at some of the ongoing surveys, like I like referring back to the LinkedIn talent survey when they survey a ton of person, right? What does come up as the number one topic of priority for people when it comes to like choosing a company? Compensation and benefits, right? It's not flexibility, meaning, and so on. At the end of the day, the first thing that is the most important thing for people and candidates, if we have candidates, is compensation and benefits. And when you zoom in once more on the topic of compensation and benefits and why it's important to people and candidates, it's not necessarily the amount of money you're getting. Of course, is important, right? The amount of money you're getting, especially like well, for blue collar workers or people close to the minimum wages and so on. Like it's super important to make a living, especially with the current cost of living crisis and so on. Yet when you go a bit higher in terms of the salaries and so on, what matters most is not necessarily the amount, even though it matters, is the perception of fairness, right? I love whenever I talk to like a few HR professional, I'm like, they all lived the same thing in a way that like you increase someone, you give someone a 20% increase. Person is incredibly happy, but then the person realizes that 20% get them 10 euros below a certain colleague and so on. Boom. All of the joy and happiness is gone and it turns back into like complete disengagement, right? So the 20% amount, which is a huge, biggest increase of people's career, is gone. So like the perception of fairness, and there was a study by Josh Bersin, great, probably the top HR analyst out there, that showed that on average, the perception of fairness when it comes to compensation matters 13 times more than the actual amount people are getting. People want to know they're being treated fairly. It's a big, big thing, right?
Definitely. And do you feel like there's downstream impacts in the aftermath when it comes to compensation?
Yeah, of course. Like, and that's when we zoom in onto the higher time, right? And getting someone in at a certain cash amount. Like, it's always the same thing, but when you zoom in on the recruiting, like the hiring part is not the end goal. Like the candidate accepting the offer, not the end goal. The candidate becomes an employee, and then it's the beginning of the employee life cycle journey, I know, right? So some of the most classical things of compensation impacting downstream from the recruiting process, I think the number one biggest example of this is like hiring someone at the top of a salary range or potentially above a salary range just to close a candidate. And I've seen that firsthand. It was a disaster. In order to close a candidate, to meet their demand, you go and put out an offer that's like at the top of the range, above salary range, candidate accept, join the company, get to the first compensation review cycle and being told, yeah, I'm sorry, you're not going to get any increase. Because as you know, you're at top of the range or above. Well, I didn't know that. Why you were not told that offer time? I wasn't. Well, you should have, right? You should have been told, well, we're giving you this offer, but just heads up, you're at the top of the range, which is a very high offer. It's going to slow down your potential compensation increase down the line unless you get promoted to a higher level and so on. This type of thing, I've seen that countless time of it being forgotten during the hiring process, and then it's coming back throughout the employee life cycle and being an absolute disaster in terms of engagement. Yeah, that's the number one example I've seen.
I've sort of wondered if that scenario is a lose-lose because I've been in this situation before as well, where at a former company, I had gotten an offer approved that was at the very top of the band. They said, make sure you communicate clearly that this person will not be, receiving any additional compensation unless, like you said, they get promoted. Other than that, they're at the very top of the range. They're unless the comp bands change significantly, which they're not likely to, that's going to be the case. But then I feel like sometimes even when you communicate this with a candidate and they accept and they're like, well, I'd obviously rather be making more now than wait, they still then turn over because they're still upset that they're not getting a raise when it's been communicated. So in my mind, I don't even know if there's a win in that scenario.
Well, I think at least like you were fair to them, like you told them the truth. And once again, it goes back to this perception of fairness. Fairness is applying consistent rules to treat everyone. We're giving you this. This is why we're not going above this because we have salary ranges, blah, blah, blah. And you know how you're going to be treated. This is a perception. But at the end of the day, it goes back to one reason I named this company Figures, right? It plays onto the fact that it's both figures, both representative of a number, and like both in French and English, it represents someone about the people's body. So it's a way I like compensation and like salary is both just a brute number, but also ties to people behind those numbers and their emotion, their background, their desire for recognition, and so on. Like compensation is such an emotional topic at times that even if you did the right thing, you never know what's behind someone's like motive or expectation on salary. So yeah, but at least you get to do this. You get to do this because you're like, hey, we told you it's gonna be that way. Take it or leave it. We're being fair to you, like we're being fair to everyone.
I might be getting to a hot take early, but what do you think about recruiting teams or recruiters or hiring managers coming down on people for compensation being a number one priority? Because I feel like there are a lot of times where people will say, well, if compensation is your number one priority, like we're not the place for you, or they ding candidates for caring about that when, according to this LinkedIn talent survey, it's the number one, it's a number one topic, a number one importance to people. Is it
Yeah,
short-sighted, I
I
guess, to
really don't know.
think that?
Yeah, I really don't get this one. And in fact, but I think it's first of all, it's a bit cultural. Like in some culture, it's like, and I'd say that in a way, in the US culture, it's a lot more open than it is in French culture, and been proven that people hate that. So it could be coming into a role and being like, yeah, I mean, compensation is my number one priority for the role. Then once that settled in, then we can get to other topic. It's just so badly perceived. But in a way, one that most people like people saying that are probably on average more honest than other candidates. And honesty probably doesn't pay off. It makes you look like a candidate that's a bit greedy and so on, which it shouldn't. Like at the end of the day, when you're recruiting should be about stating your desire as clearly as possible and ensuring that the company and the role will match what you're looking for as clearly as possible, right? That's why transparency should be key and encouraged. But when it's like being frowned upon by like judgment on value and so on, oh, you care about compensation first. Well, we're not that type of company. You should look elsewhere and so on. Yeah, I really don't get it. Really don't get it.
My prediction for 2024 is that candidates are going to be saying that a lot more because people are starting to realize that companies aren't valuing them as human beings as much with all the layoffs and things. People have
Ooh.
experienced all these things. So like, well, if anything else, at least I'll have the compensation to, carry myself through if there's a bad time. But I hate to say this, but I do think companies did this to themselves a little bit.
Well, that's a spicy take, but in a way, like especially when you think about tech, the tech space, right? So if you zoom into the tech space a little bit, what people have gone through, like, yeah, let's hire like crazy, let's double in size the next year, let's just fire most people we just hire and so on. Dealing with those experiences and so on, it does affect people. So you can't expect them to go back and being like, oh, roses and whatever as the proper English expresses, roses and cakes, rainbows, rainbows and ponies. I don't know
Rainbows
what
and
the proper
sunshine.
expression is. Rainbows and sunshine, right? After that kind of experience. So I think so. I think it's not cynical to expect more and more candidates to be like that open about, you know what, I'll care first and foremost about like getting compensation right and so on. This whole adventure you're selling me and so on, like been there, done that in a way. But you know what, as well, one other factor that's going to play a lot into it, it's like the pay transparency. I keep talking about the pay transparency era we're getting into, right? Pay transparency laws in the US, pay transparency laws coming into Europe. That's going to change people and candidates like way of approaching compensation during hiring a ton. Like, and that's one reason why TA and recruiters should be more prepared for compensation discussions, because they're going to get a lot more questions from candidates moving forward, a lot more questions moving forward.
Agreed. And last sort of bit here before we move on to tactically how companies can implement a proper strategy to help with this. Why do you feel like recruiters aren't trained for compensation strategy, or what's the missing piece? Why is it that there's such a big gap there?
Well, the first thing is sometimes doesn't even exist, the compensation strategy, right? Most of the time when the company grows, they just make ad hoc decision after ad hoc decision, like what does the candidate want? Does it look normal to me? Can we negotiate? Let's go. And they can, some companies have been operating that way at 50, 100, 200, 300 employees. And so it's just not structure in place, right? There's no compensation strategy in place. Especially as once again, in the previous era, compensation was just so much of a black box, under discussed topic that companies could get away with it, right? They could get away with doing those ad hoc decisions, not having any clear structure and no real structure and fairness in place, right? So I think the number one reason is that. Number two reason, I say that overall, and maybe another hot take from me, HR don't like compensation. On average, most HR folk don't like compensation too much. It's a very numbers heavy thing, right? And then on average, once again, HR don't like numbers too much. So they tend to shy away from taking on those challenges versus tackling, I don't know, onboarding, performance review, engagement, and so on. So I think that's the case. And sometimes when there's a strategy in place, when there's processes in place, TA ends up at the end of the food chain and just not being empowered to have the discussion. You know, they're not being trained properly. They're not being given the right level of information about compensation strategy, processes, and the right level of information that empowers them to have the right level of discussion towards candidates. I think even when that's in place, I've seen very few companies where they seem to nail empowering the TA team to talk about and sell compensation to any given candidate. Like I've not seen that many companies being that great at it, to be honest.
Do you think that the empowerment piece plays into people operations historically not liking to manage it because they're not empowered to do so?
Do you know, there's a chicken and egg thing about like people experience and just, yeah, power and so on, depending on who you believe, right? They're not given enough time, budget, and consideration. Therefore, they can't have a role. They can't have as much impact as they should be able to. Therefore, they have limited impact. Therefore, they're like, hey, your role doesn't have an impact. Why should we give more budget, time, resources, whatever, right? Vicious circle is there, but I don't know, like chicken and egg. Does it start because people experience on average doesn't show enough impact, or does it start because they are not given the budget to do so? I tend to believe the latter, right? But of course, I'm biased being a former people experience myself. But for sure as well, I think it tends to, once you give them enough time and resources, you can demonstrate the impact of doing something like that. And I think it's necessary to have a well-working TA function.
For sure. TA teams are obviously the ones that are really selling the company, like you said, the upside of the company more than anyone else to in the business to candidates. Tactically, help me understand a little bit about what people can do to guide compensation philosophy, because like you said, I think there's a lot of companies where that is a big missing piece. They don't have a compensation philosophy yet. So where do you even begin with that?
That's a good question. So first of all, that's not a people experience or TA topic, right? Or recruiting topic. That's like a founders or founding team topic. But it needs to be facilitated by people experience or the people team whatsoever, right? So the people like compensation strategy piece is answering a few questions that will guide all of your compensation decisions moving forward in a way, right? The most important ones, like when you zoom in, is like how do we want to be positioned against the market? What's our view on compensation? Do we want to be hyper competitive? And how does it tie to our company culture, right? It should be in a way an extension of the company culture, right? The obvious example most people know is like the Netflix example of being like, we have a high, like a culture of high performance and high expectation. And therefore what, you know what, we're going to pay you the max of whatever we can. And I know it has changed a little bit in the recent months or years, but that's an example of, okay, our compensation strategy derived from who we want to be as a company and our company culture. But when you zoom in onto the practical question, it's like, how do you want to be positioned on the market? Who are you competing against? And that's like product competition, that's talent competition, right? You might be a B2B accounting software. You're not competing for talent for only B2B with other B2B accounting softwares, right? It's like, who are you competing against? How are you positioned against the market? What's your view on, like, for example, variable pay? Do you believe in the power of variable pay as an element that's like motivating, stimulating, drives performance individual? Like I don't, for example. What do you believe when it comes to equity? Should you give equity to everyone who's in the company? What's your view on that? Only a selected amount of people, only top performers, most senior people. Benefits. Benefits seems like there's no strategy around benefits, but there are. Like, what are the key benefits you want to implement because you believe in them, because it's tied to your company culture and so on. So the list goes on, but the compensation strategy is like what key belief and decision you're going to take, that are going to help you down the road, make any offer to candidate, like decide which benefits to implement, decide what packages to build, and so on, right? Those are the key questions you need to be able to answer in order to have that structure in place that will facilitate any of your future decisions down the line.
Yeah, and I know that you had mentioned something previously about having very like clear rules set in place. Can you tell me more about tactically how you go about setting those rules? And I guess I'm also curious, like, what is TA's role as a stakeholder in this discussion? Because, like you said, I think the philosophy is very much like founder level, but where does TA come in and where can TA help support this philosophy?
Mm. So, on your first question, right? It's a great one. It's like there's a concept of procedural fairness, right? Which is the fact of treating people in a structured way, right? Which is a form of fairness. Is like you might not think the result, right? We were getting back to the example of sending a candidate an offer, and he or she might not like the offer, right? But you're like, okay, but the way we got to this offer, we follow the process, and the process that enforces fairness. And this is super important because when you link back to what I was saying previously, which was people care about fairness. They care about the perception of being treated fairly. One way of showing them you're treating them fairly is by putting procedures and processes in place to treat them fairly, to make fair offer, to make a fair compensation offer, to make fair compensation reviews and so on, and to explain this process to them, right? So in a way, it's super important and going to be more and more important in this pay transparency era to be able to explain those decisions, because you're going to need to be able to explain them more than you used to, because once again, there's going to be so much more, and there is so much more like information about compensation out in the open. Pay transparency laws in the US, you're well placed, right? It's like more and more salary ranges and job ads that are prompting questions of more and more questions from candidates and employees alike. And that means there's going to be more questions. Okay, you've put the salary range on the job ad, but how did you drive the salary range? Why those numbers? How did you come up to this salary range? Well, you know what? Our compensation strategy is to pay at the 60th percentile of the market. We use this market data to inform us on what the state of the market is for our market, which we consider to be Series A to Series C, tech companies within our area. We're looking at the market. We look at the 60th percentile. We take that to drive our salary ranges. Our salary ranges are based of plus or minus 20% of that midpoint. And this is how we come to the salary band of the role you've seen, right? And then you can go into the story of how did we build, looking at the candidate, how did we build the offer we're making, but we looked at the salary band, we look at your experience and so on, right? You can build it down from here. But once again, that's an example of, we're showing you, we have a structured way of looking at compensation. And the way we come up with our salary bands and the offer we're about to make you, or the compensation review you're going to get once you join your company, is structurally or procedurally fair because there's a process to it, right? And that's super reassuring to people. Yeah, well, TA role is on all this. I think you start from the end. You're like, as a TA professional, when I get a candidate, can I explain all of it? Is a bit of storytelling, right? Can I explain the structural flow? When I'm making out an offer, can I explain how the offer was made, what it was based upon, what each element of the offer contain, and how does it work? Like, if I'm being just told, this is the equity amount that you have to send to the candidate, but I have no idea on like how this was built, any details on vesting, any details on clauses, any details on eligibility, does everyone receive them or not? Like, you work back on, you want to be able to sell a package and the reasoning behind this package to a candidate. And if you can't, you need to be able to say, hey, folks, like, I can't do my job well because I can't tell like the whole story of how in our company we're taking those compensation decisions in a fair and structured way. I can't explain it to candidates, so I need to be empowered to explain it. So if you don't have any compensation strategy or logic or process, just like, please do it, and maybe I'm willing to contribute. And if you do, I need to be informed and trained onto its content because I want to be the most impactful recruiter possible when facing candidates. And that's going to be, once again, an increasingly important part of TA. When with the paid transparency era, more and more questions from candidates are going to come. You need to be able to answer them, because at equal offer, if a recruiter for another company sells the package better, you might lose out to someone who's have a very equivalent offer or maybe a lower offer, but just the story behind it, the reasoning behind it is going to reassure the candidate a lot more, and you're going to lose out. Plain and simple.
Yeah, I think the storytelling that goes along with the candidates' motivations, maybe they have a family of 5 or 6 and benefits is really important to them. Maybe they're trying to get a down payment on a house soon, so cash is really important to them. So it's important to know what your candidates are thinking and be able to explain the philosophy in a way that makes the candidate feel like they were considered in the process. So I think that's definitely good advice. And in terms of areas that TA teams should really understand and put an emphasis on, I know that you had mentioned just briefly earlier that benefits is something that can be really overlooked. Can you tell me a little bit about, pitching benefits and, in your mind, how that plays into sort of like a total compensation, total rewards philosophy there?
Yeah, it's a great question, because benefits on average, especially in more mature companies that tends to have more benefits, is often an inefficient compensation and benefits mechanism because it's often misunderstood or not sold enough, right? So in a way, I think that's what's important. So linking back to what I was saying earlier on, it's important to be able to know and pitch its benefits, and to pitch it in a way that we know on which we're being hyper competitive and on which benefit we might not be. And which leads me to my next point. What I find when it comes to benefits, and there's two main points. The first thing is, it's better to have one or two hyper impacting and differentiating benefits than a multitude of benefits, right? It's super hard it's way, I found that like the most attractive company might have one or two benefits, like killer benefits, that they are they do great storytelling once again around. They have like use cases and so on. Like one of our clients, for example, have this benefit where after 2 years of seniority, you get 1 month off paid by the company. And I don't even know the rest of the benefits they have because they're selling this one so damn well. They put out on social media use like example of employees what they did with their months off. And of course, it's a big employer branding selling point internally, externally, and so on, right? They market the crap out of these benefits so damn well overall on social media to candidates. I don't even know what other benefits they have. It's better to overmarket and supermarket well one benefit over than have a list of like 4 or 5 competitive benefits that are going to be lost, I think, in the shuffle of your explanation. And the second thing is, and I know you've heard that quite a bit, but I always tend to look at a like great salesperson, and most of the sales methodology applies super well to TA. And the important part is sales is discovery, right? It's discovering the pain and the value prospects, and therefore in this case, candidates are looking to solve and so on. And therefore benefits is often more contextual to each person. Some people might want to be zooming in on like retirement, pension, and so on. Some more might be zooming in on medical because that's important to them, their condition, their family, and so on. So good discovery from a recruiter should enable the person to pitch one or two or the 2 or 3 most important benefits or compensation elements to a candidate.
100%. And one thing that I think about too is that you may run into a scenario where a candidate says, "Hey, like this salary is actually less than I'm making right now." It's not even about, and it's actually not legal in many places to ask, what they're currently making and things like that. But just say they mentioned that you can also pull out the cards and say, "Okay, well, I know that you had mentioned you have, X number of people in your family. We actually pay for all dependents on insurance. So that's, thousands and thousands of dollars of savings a year." And so people can start to mathematically add things up to say, okay, actually like now we're in a good place. So that discovery piece is definitely really important because if you sell everything, not everything is relevant to everybody. So you really need to understand
Mhm.
what's important to them, what's relevant to them, and sell it in that way.
Yeah, 100%. And this is why I think it's super similar. That's the area in which the role of recruiter is super similar to the role of talent acquisition and to sales, sorry, in the way of like doing a good discovery enables you to then sell your offer down the line, sell the company, sell the role the best way possible because you adapt it to the context of each person, right?
Yes. Tell me about, so I know we had previously chatted a little bit about, base salary, OTE, especially for people like salespeople, go to market people who have a more heavy reliance on quotas and commission and bonus. What questions should recruiters be asking hiring managers about, how many people are hitting quota, things like that, so that they can really sell the opportunity to a candidate?
Yeah, so great question because like once again, I said that overall, a good example of a compensation philosophy and strategy, like I'm a strongly against bonuses on average for most roles, except for salesperson in which I believe into the alignment and the win-win alignment of commissions and like sales related bonuses and so on. So same thing that I was saying earlier on is like you start off from the story you want to be able to pull out. And like you should be able to sell out your commission scheme, your historical rates of achievement and so on, because you're going to get questions such as, yeah, on average, how much of the sales team does attain quota? What was the average quota attainment on the last period? Whether that was like quarter or last year, depending on the sales cycle. Of course, like SMB sales cycle are like shorter than like enterprise and so on. What do you do? A ramp up methodology when if I start tomorrow, are my objectives going to be adjusted when I start to reflect the fact that I'm ramping up into the role, or I'm going to get what is usually the achievement rate of news higher, or how do you attune to that? Do you guarantee any form of commission on the first month, the first quarter? It's like how are objectives defined and how often are they changed? How is it communicated? How am I going to pay it monthly, quarterly? I mean, there's a bunch of questions that you need to be ready for. And you know what? I think at the end of the day, you can't plan for every question, but as soon as you get one, you need to be able to get the answer and you need to be able to ideally propagate the answer to the rest of the team and remember it for next time. Because yeah, salesperson tends to have a lot of questions when it comes to like commissions and so on, and you need to be ready for those.
Yeah, and they're completely fair questions. Again, when you're in
Yeah.
a situation and someone's asking these questions and you're like, "Oh, well, they had a lot of questions about compensation." It's like, well, they should because every compensation structure is different at every company. So candidates actually should ask more questions about this, but they don't because they don't want to appear greedy or like that's the only thing they care about. And so we're in a
Mm.
little bit of a bad cycle here with that. But a selling point in itself, I feel like for TA teams is being understanding that the candidate cares about compensation and making sure you answer their questions because the next company may not.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. And in a
So,
way, the beauty of like sales commission and incentive is that they're often very revealing of the role's objective, right? It's like, so, like, in fact, being quite upfront of what's in the incentives and objectives should be a way to align candidates' expectation with the role's expectation in a way, because there's like, it's the absolute truth. Incentives in sales tend to be what the company wants you to focus on and what you're going to be evaluated upon, which is a key criteria for candidates, right? So more clarity on sales commission and incentives is a big thing to bring clarity to candidates.
yeah, I was just going to ask, should companies have all of that information like in a one pager to hand out, or should they wait for candidates to ask the question? Like, would it actually
Mhm.
be more advantageous for companies to put that information out there? Like, here's what the commission structure is. Here's what the average attainment is. Here was the max last year. Here's all this information. Because I think a lot of companies just wait for people to ask, but wouldn't it be great if they gave the information up front?
Well, I think that I think that's a microcosm of like the discussion on pay transparency, right? Which is a mind-blowing thing to me. So of course I'm a bit biased, right? I'm a bit biased towards transparency. So I'll state this beforehand. However, I think it's a bit crazy to think that the norm has always been to find out the condition on the role, especially compensation, sometimes at the end of the process. Like if you were to buy a new car, you want to visit a house and there was like no listed price. Like, no, come and visit the house. Come and visit it 2, 3, 4 times, meet different people, give us all those documents and so on. At the end, we'll tell you the price of the house. Like everyone will find that crazy. Same at the grocery store, same at like a car dealership. And somehow it's been accepted that the condition for like employment could be stated just at the end of the hiring process. And I think this is the kind of thing that I think in a few decades from now, when people are going to look back at this era, we are all going to look crazy for just assuming this is normal or having assumed it's normal. Like this thing is mind-boggling to me. So
For
yes,
sure.
I'm all in favor of transparency. And you know what? Once again, inevitable. We're moving towards more and more transparent pay transparency. There's not and more transparency overall, not only on pay, but pay being a key thing that's happening right now. There's no turning back. It's inevitable. So I think there's like two ways. Either you wait for it to become the market norm, either you seize the opportunity to be ready before the other ones. And then there's a huge competitive advantage to being one of the first pay transparency ready company, one of the first to put it out there, one of the first to do that, right? The classical example, of course, very tech-centered as well, which is Buffer when they posted their compensation practices very publicly. I think they got a 40x increase in applications, right? And just, I'm seeing it today where in figures, if you go to one of our job ads, we put salary ranges in multiple locations. We explain how each of the ranges are built. We explain what happens if you're in a city that we don't have ranges for. We explain the process of what's happening. We link to our public compensation strategy, policy, and so on. And you know what? The effect in having to attracting candidates and closing candidates is better than if I were to be like less transparent and increase all of my compensation bands by 10%. I'll close down and attract less candidates that I'm doing it right now.
For sure. I'm definitely a big believer in get it right before it has to legally be right because you're just going to be in such a better position for success. The sort of last piece here is equity, and I feel like this is, in my
Oof.
opinion, the biggest gap that I've seen in, when I was doing recruiting and what people really felt comfortable selling, whether it be public or startup, the vesting cycle, like you said. What goes into this? And kind of similar question to before, like what questions should TA people know the answers to so that they can properly sell equity to their candidates?
So first of all, I say this as a disclaimer. This is a topic on which there's the biggest discrepancy in terms of knowledge, especially between like US and the rest of the world. Like I think US on average and US candidates on average have an understanding of equity that surpasses most people, experienced professional in Europe. Like the average candidates in the US understand equity more than most European people experienced leaders. I say this to start with. So like that's the area on which most people are are like confused, let's say. So like equity is different, as you was mentioning, from a public company to a private company, a startup, and so on. Like you need to understand like RSUs, shares, company shares versus stock option. Like what percentage of TA people do you think, once again, working in mostly startup giving out stock option, do really understand what a stock option is? Like I say, what percentage? I mean, that's as sadly, I say people need to understand the basic. What's like a company, what's like a share, what's like a startup, what's a vesting schedule, what's an exercise price, and then you get into like complex stuff. But just being able to explain that and potential like implication of like a stock option and valuation increase and like exercise price being below the fair market value, the liquidity or illiquidity of a share and so on, like just some of those base principles. If you're working to a company where equity is part of your compensation package, there's no reason for you not to know, right? You should be able to at least know the basics, ideally master the advanced question. What's the exercise period once I leave the company? Like
Yeah,
30
like
days,
what's the
90
strike
days, the
price?
evergreen,
What's the yeah, all of those
the strike
things.
price.
The thing that's the most surprising to me is that even people who work at, I wouldn't necessarily call them startups, let's just say like unicorns, not public, but not startups, kind of in limbo, are actually giving out RSUs instead of options. So there's a lot of private companies that come to a point where they're like, okay, we're close to IPO and now we're giving RSUs instead of options. And that is wildly different than having having a theoretical option that's like
Yes,
$1,000 per option, you know?
but you know what? And you know what? I've seen a case like that of a company offering RSUs to people. A similar reason, right? Getting closer to IPO and so on. But that candidate being like, you know what? Yes, I was hesitating between a company like that and another like scale up ish company. But the other one offered me like nearly twice the amount of equity. I was like, yeah, well, one was RSUs, the other was the amount of equity was the sum of stock option exercise price that might be overpriced as well. The other one was like shares, company share, but people didn't even get that, right? They see the
Right,
amount,
and
oh,
you
we're
have to
offering
buy
you.
those. You have to buy options.
Yes,
RSUs
yes.
are a gift and part of your compensation, so it's yeah, we could probably do an entire, like, equity
Full episode.
equity 101 training, but I think it's really an important topic that honestly is so vast, so maybe we come back to
Mm,
that to the details a different time because I do think that recruiters being equipped and, the last thing I've really noticed about this is that if a recruiter has only worked at a public company or only worked at a startup, that really frames their ability to sell in a certain way. And so
yes.
then they may go to a different company that has a different setup and they can really struggle to get the details nailed down. Amazing. Well, last question here before we get into some of our more standard questions we like to ask folks. If you were a global leader working with candidates in different countries, should should you think about pitching compensation different geographically?
Meaning, yeah. So you should, for sure. You should, because I mean, base salary is base salary, right? Once you get, but then there's a lot of element around compensation that are localized, right? Germany, at some point, like if you start doing some enterprise sales or even some mid-market sales in Germany, you're going to be asked about company car. You're going to be asked about company car. When you go to Belgium, you're going to be asked about like incorporating benefits into your salary, like salary optimization scheme. When you go to the US, you're going to be able to explain equity. When you go to, I was about to say, like UK is going to be pension contribution and so on. So there's an element of compensation that is different geographically. You need to adapt some of your compensation structure to those geographical difference, and you need to be able to pitch it differently. 100%. 100%, because it goes back to what we were saying, adapting the global company package and strategy into some of the candidate specificities. One of those specificities being the different culture, working environment and location and so on. You should.
Yeah, like benefits is huge in the US because it's majority privatized, but in other countries that is
Yeah.
absolutely not the case at all. So benefits are not as much of a competitive advantage because it's more streamlined across
Mhm.
everybody in the country. So, yeah, that's such a good point, and I think as more companies hire more globally, they need to think about these before they start opening a bunch of global roles, not during
Yep.
or after.
Yes, exactly. But that is hard though. That's one of the reasons, like, want those global companies hiring everywhere, having to think of those difference in each geographies. That is hard. That's a hard part of compensation, like localization of packages and explanation of those localization and so on. It's not easy.
It's not at all. Taking a step back to think higher level, I would love to hear what you think hiring excellence means to you.
I think the number one thing, and we've touched on it a little bit throughout the episode, right, was the personalization of the process of the offer and so on, like making each process unique and uniquely tailored to the candidate expectation, values, like culture and so on. I think that's, to me, that's the definition of hiring experience. Is like when you were to interview two different, like interview post hire two different candidates, and they will tell a very different story of how like the same recruiter has approached them, sold them the job, behaved with them. Like I think that hiring excellence to me is the ability to like just take one company, one role, one manager, the same one, but pitch it and sell it entirely differently to two different candidates, right? And I'm not saying, I don't mean selling the wrong package, like telling lies. I mean, just once again, adapting your pitch, adapting the way your candidate management and the experience you're gonna provide the candidate with like hyper personalization, right? I think that's, to me, that's the number one hiring. That's what I call hiring excellence. And like the best TA people I've managed or work with tend to be the one that have like this super amazing ability to tailor their recruiting experience to their candidates.
Totally. You can have a streamlined, equitable, and fair process while adapting certain parts so that the candidate feels like you are personalizing their experience. Personalizing doesn't mean you're not, doing the things that you need to do to keep the process fair.
Exactly. 100%. Super aligned with that.
Well, we are at my last, final, and favorite question. What is your recruiting hot take?
So I don't know how spicy it is, but there's been this wave. I kept reading on LinkedIn and everything, people blasting companies for their hiring processes of like, oh, if it has more than 3 steps or 3 interviews, it's bad. You should look at yourself in the mirror and consider it bad and so on. I'm a long process fan, and I tend to hire. Our processes are quite long, and I tend to, as a candidate, I like long processes. So my view is joining a company and a role is one of the biggest decision you can make, like on your day-to-day life. Like you spend so much time at work, like ensuring you find the right role with the right setup, the right team, the right culture, the right challenges. So damn important that I don't want to hear the thing of like it can be done in like 3 1-hour interviews. Like I don't. I personally strongly disagree with that. And so our processes are quite long. It doesn't mean they can't be short, right? Time to hire is important. You can be super sharp into setting up those interviews and case studies and so on, and giving good prompt feedback, super and so on, but having enough steps to you as a company ensure that you evaluate people the best way possible. And as candidates, ensure that you have as much information as possible from on the company, culture, role, team, challenges to make the right call. So I'm a big, long process fan, and it seems to be completely against the grain and the norm now. Like everyone been saying that. I'm nearly ashamed of saying that publicly.
I mean, people might come with their pitchforks for you, but hopefully not. I mean, I think there's a difference between long processes that are completely unintentional and all over the place with no structure. There's a difference between that and a longer process that has structure and purpose. And so I think the two often get conflated together where it's just one big lump of like, I hate long processes. And I think candidates get frustrated because the process is long. It seems without intention, without purpose. They weren't prepped well.
Yes.
So there's things that you can do to make it right and give candidates opportunities to do their evaluation in a more lengthy process. So I think I'm in the middle on it with a lot of nuance and caveats, but you may some people may come for your head after that one.
You know, they're gonna come for my head even more when I say that in my previous company, the one I was a VP of people for, every hiring process, that's gonna scare everyone. The end of each process was 2 days spent within the company, right? Just observing, talking to people, one-on-ones. There was no work involved. It was not like you come in for 2 days and work and we see if you hire you. It was a validation process, meaning we would get only one candidate there. If it end up well on both ends, we will make the offer, we'll commit to make the offer. But it was 2 days spent. I spent 2 days in this company as I was back when I was working in another company. And you know what? The best thing I ever did. Best thing I ever did was spending 2 days with my future colleagues, team, peers, seeing how people were interacting, seeing people were just talking to each other, working in meetings, behaving at the coffee machine and so on. Like I had the ultimate proof of what I was about to join. But yeah, there was 2 days of leave I had to take from my previous company to do that.
Yeah, that's a whole nother rabbit hole about being paid
Yes.
to do that and that sort of thing. But I think
Yes.
it's important to try things, to innovate, as long as you have a firm hypothesis for your test, then you can go out and try it. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, okay. Now we know. Now we know it doesn't work and we'll try something else. But I know we're coming up on our time here. Where should people go to learn more about you and Figures?
It's going to be very boring, but it's going to be on LinkedIn. I mean, I try to post quite a bit. We try to post quite a bit. So you can subscribe to me on LinkedIn and get tired very quickly of those compensation takes after compensation takes, because not many people can take those on a regular basis. But I guess that's where to find us and find me.
Perfect. Well, really appreciate you joining us today on Offer Accepted. I think this is going to be really, really valuable. And hopefully sometime soon we can dig in a little bit deeper to some of these topics because there's just so much to cover around compensation. But thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Offer Accepted, the podcast for ambitious recruiting professionals, brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and share with your TA community. We'll see you next time.